In the bitter cold of February 1916, along the rolling hills of northeastern France, two mighty armies faced each other across a landscape that would soon become synonymous with human suffering. What began as a calculated German strategy to bleed France dry would transform into the longest, most devastating battle in modern history. For 302 days, over 700,000 men would fall in a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. This is the story of Verdun, where the very soul of France hung in the balance, and where hell itself seemed to open upon the earth. The year 1915 had been a stalemate of blood and mud. Across the Western Front, millions of soldiers crouched in trenches that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Machine guns ruled no man's land. Artillery pounded positions into moonscapes of craters and corpses, and every attack seemed to accomplish nothing but adding more names to the casualty lists. The war that politicians had promised would be over by Christmas 1914 had devoured an entire generation, yet neither side could claim victory. In Berlin, General Erich von Falkenhayn, the German chief of staff, stared at maps that told a grim story. Germany was fighting a war on multiple fronts, her resources stretched thin, her people growing weary of endless sacrifice. The great offensive strategies of 1914 had failed. The Schlieffen Plan lay in ruins. Something had to change, or the Central Powers would slowly be crushed by the weight of the Allied war machine. Falkenhayn was not a man given to grand gestures or romantic notions of warfare. He was a cold strategist who understood that wars were won not by capturing cities or breaking through lines, but by destroying the enemy's will to fight. His eyes settled on a name that would soon echo through history: Verdun, a fortress city that had guarded the approaches to Paris for centuries, a symbol of French pride and determination. More importantly, it was a place the French could never abandon. The German plan was diabolical in its simplicity. They would not try to capture Verdun quickly. Instead, they would force the French to defend it at any cost, then bleed them white with artillery fire and methodical attacks. As Falkenhayn coldly calculated, there were objectives within German reach for which the French General Staff would be compelled to throw in every man they had. If they did so, the forces of France would bleed to death. The city of Verdun sat in a salient, a bulge in the French lines that jutted into German-held territory. This geographic weakness made it vulnerable to attack from three sides, while a ring of 19 massive forts provided its defense. These concrete and steel behemoths, built in the 1892, had once represented the pinnacle of military engineering. Their thick walls and underground galleries seemed impregnable to the weapons of the previous century. But warfare had evolved with terrifying speed. The German army now possessed weapons that would have seemed like the instruments of gods to earlier generations. The massive 420mm siege guns, nicknamed Big Berthas, could hurl shells weighing nearly a ton over distances of more than 6 miles. These monsters had already proven their worth by reducing the Belgian forts at Liège to rubble in 1914. Even more ominous were the new tactics of artillery bombardment. German gunners had perfected techniques that could saturate entire square miles with explosive shells, creating killing zones where nothing could survive. They had learned to coordinate different types of artillery, mixing high explosive shells that destroyed fortifications with shrapnel rounds that shredded human flesh, and poison gas shells that turned the very air into a weapon. The French, however, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. In 1915, convinced that modern artillery made fixed fortifications obsolete, the French General Staff had stripped the Verdun forts of most of their heavy guns and garrison troops. These weapons and men were desperately needed elsewhere along the front, they reasoned, and the forts themselves were judged to be death traps that could not withstand modern bombardment. Fort Douaumont, the largest and most imposing of the Verdun fortifications, stood nearly empty. This massive structure, protected by layers of concrete over a meter thick and surrounded by a 7-meter deep moat and 30 meters of barbed wire, housed barely 60 men, instead of the hundreds it was designed to shelter. The French had effectively disarmed their own strongest position, just as their enemies prepared to attack it. As winter deepened in early 1916, German preparations intensified. Crown Prince Wilhelm, the Kaiser's eldest son, was given command of the Fifth Army, the force designated to carry out Operation Judgment. Despite his royal title, Wilhelm was an experienced commander who understood the magnitude of the task ahead. His army assembled in the forests around Verdun like a coiled spring, ready to unleash destruction on an unprecedented scale. The German buildup was methodical and massive. More than 1,300 guns were positioned in carefully concealed positions, ranging from light field pieces to the enormous siege mortars that had crushed Belgian resistance. Ammunition dumps grew into small mountains of shells, each one destined to add to the coming symphony of destruction. Railway lines were extended to carry the tons of supplies needed to feed the artillery beast. Elite German assault troops trained in new tactics designed to exploit the chaos that would follow the bombardment. These Stoßtruppen, or shock troops, were equipped with flamethrowers, grenades, and portable machine guns. They learned to advance in small groups, bypassing strong points and penetrating deep into enemy positions before the defenders could recover from the artillery barrage. French intelligence detected signs of the German buildup, but the scale and intent remained unclear. Reports filtered back of increased enemy activity, of new gun positions being prepared, of fresh divisions moving into the sector. Yet the French High Command focused on their own planned offensives for 1916, failed to grasp the magnitude of the threat gathering before Verdun. General Joseph Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, remained convinced that the Germans lacked the strength for a major offensive. His attention was focused on the planned Anglo-French assault along the Somme River, scheduled for summer 1916. Verdun, in his view, was a quiet sector where worn-out divisions could rest and recover from the rigors of more active fronts. The defenders of Verdun consisted primarily of reserve divisions and territorial units, older men, and those deemed unfit for service in more critical sectors. Their positions were thinly held, their supplies limited, their morale dampened by months of inactivity and the bitter cold of an unusually harsh winter. Many of the trenches were poorly constructed, lacking the deep dugouts and sophisticated obstacles that characterized positions elsewhere along the front. As February progressed, German artillery began what appeared to be routine harassing fire against French positions. These preliminary bombardments served multiple purposes, registering targets for the coming storm, while masking the true scale of preparations. French soldiers huddled in their inadequate shelters, cursing the enemy shells but having no inkling that they were merely the prelude to an apocalypse. The weather itself seemed to conspire against the defenders. Thick snow blanketed the hills around Verdun, making movement difficult and observation nearly impossible. The cold was so severe that weapons jammed, water froze in canteens, and men suffered from frostbite even in their trenches. Supply lines, already stretched thin, became even more precarious as trucks and wagons struggled through the icy roads. On the night of February 20th, an eerie quiet settled over the Verdun sector. German batteries that had been firing intermittently fell silent. In the French trenches, soldiers welcomed the respite, unaware that their enemies were making final preparations for the most concentrated artillery bombardment in military history. Gun crews checked their weapons one last time, ammunition was stacked within easy reach, and observation posts prepared to direct the storm that would break with the dawn. The stage was set for a battle that would redefine the very meaning of warfare, where courage and cowardice, heroism and horror would be forged in the crucible of industrial-scale killing. In just a few hours, the quiet hills of Verdun would erupt in flames that would burn for 10 months, consuming armies and reshaping the destiny of nations. At 4:15 in the morning on February 21st, 1916, the world exploded. In a single, earth-shattering moment, 1,300 German guns opened fire simultaneously across an 8-mile front. The sound was beyond human comprehension, a roar that could be heard over 60 miles away in Nancy. Soldiers later described it not as noise but as a physical force that crushed the breath from their lungs and turned their bowels to water. This was not artillery fire as warfare had known it before. This was the orchestrated destruction of everything that lived and breathed in the target zone. High explosive shells weighing hundreds of pounds crashed down every few seconds, each one capable of obliterating a house or creating a crater 20 feet across. Shrapnel rounds burst overhead, filling the air with thousands of razor-sharp fragments that could slice a man in half. Gas shells hissed and leaked their poisonous contents into shell holes and trenches, turning every breath into potential death. The French positions simply vanished. Trenches that had taken months to dig were erased in minutes. Communication lines were severed, command posts buried under tons of earth and concrete. Men who had survived years of war were driven mad in the first hour by the relentless, crushing weight of the bombardment. Those who tried to flee were caught in the open and torn apart by the endless rain of steel. For 10 hours, the German guns pounded the French lines without pause. When the smoke finally began to clear, the landscape looked like the surface of an alien world. Every tree had been stripped of bark and leaves, standing like skeletal fingers against the grey sky. The ground itself had been churned and rechurned until it resembled a sea of mud mixed with metal fragments and human remains. Shell holes overlapped shell holes in an endless pattern of destruction that stretched to every horizon. At 4 in the afternoon, German infantry began their advance. These were not the massed formations of earlier wars, but small groups of highly trained assault troops moving with deadly purpose. They expected to find nothing alive in the wasteland before them, yet somehow, incredibly, French soldiers emerged from the deepest dugouts and shell holes to fight back. These men, half-deaf and shell-shocked, their uniforms torn and faces blackened by explosions, represented something that Falkenhayn had not calculated into his cold equations. The German advance was methodical and terrifying. Flamethrower teams scorched French positions that showed signs of resistance, sending jets of liquid fire 30 feet through the air. Machine gun crews set up their weapons in carefully chosen positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that cut down anyone who tried to move between the shell holes. Pioneer units with explosives cleared paths through the wire obstacles that had somehow survived the bombardment. Fort Douaumont, the crown jewel of the Verdun defenses, fell on February 25th in a manner that shocked both armies. A small German patrol, comprising fewer than 20 men, had been probing the fort's perimeter when they discovered that the main entrance was unguarded. The skeleton crew inside, consisting of just 57 men commanded by a sergeant, was overwhelmed before they could even attempt to resist. The fall of Douaumont sent shockwaves through France that reached all the way to Paris. This was not merely a military defeat, but a psychological catastrophe. The fortress had been considered impregnable, a symbol of French engineering and determination. Its loss after less than a week of fighting seemed to confirm German claims that French resistance was crumbling. In the French capital, politicians and generals gathered in emergency sessions. The newspapers, despite heavy censorship, could not hide the magnitude of the disaster unfolding at Verdun. Families across France waited anxiously for news of sons, fathers, and brothers who had been stationed in what was supposed to be a quiet sector of the front. General Joffre faced the most critical decision of his career. Every military principle suggested that Verdun should be abandoned. The salient was a trap, vulnerable from 3 sides, difficult to supply and reinforce. The logical course would be to withdraw to stronger positions and let the Germans exhaust themselves in costly attacks against prepared defenses elsewhere. Yet Joffre understood that some battles transcend mere military logic. Verdun had become a symbol, and symbols cannot be abandoned without destroying the spirit of those who believe in them. To retreat from Verdun would be to admit defeat, not just in a single battle, but in the war itself. The psychological impact on French morale would be catastrophic, potentially fatal to the nation's will to continue fighting. On February 26th, Joffre made his choice. Verdun would be held at any cost. To accomplish this seemingly impossible task, he turned to a man whose reputation for defensive warfare was unmatched in the French army. General Philippe Pétain was summoned from his sector command and given direct control of the Verdun defenses with explicit orders to hold the line no matter what the cost in men or materials. Pétain arrived at his new headquarters to find chaos. Communications with the front lines had been severed by the German bombardment. Units were scattered and leaderless. The single road and railway line connecting Verdun to the rest of France were under constant artillery fire, making resupply nearly impossible. The German advance continued daily, methodically capturing key positions and closing the noose around the city. The new commander's first priority was establishing a lifeline to the outside world. The narrow road running south from Verdun to Bar-le-Duc became the focus of a massive logistical effort that would soon earn it an immortal name. This secondary highway, barely wide enough for 2 trucks to pass, would become known as the Sacred Way, the umbilical cord that kept Verdun alive through its longest ordeal. Day and night, an endless stream of vehicles moved along the Sacred Way. Trucks carried ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fresh troops to the battle. The same vehicles returned loaded with wounded men whose eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of those who had looked into the abyss. During the peak of the crisis, 1 truck passed every 14 seconds, creating traffic jams that stretched for miles. The road itself became a casualty of war. The constant passage of heavy vehicles, combined with the impact of German shells that fell short of their intended targets, reduced the surface to a quagmire of mud and broken stone. Entire companies of soldiers were assigned to road maintenance, working around the clock to keep the lifeline open. Quarries were opened nearby to provide the crushed stone needed to repair the constantly deteriorating surface. Pétain's defensive strategy was revolutionary in its methodical precision. Instead of trying to hold every position with maximum force, he created a defense in depth that would absorb German attacks and then counterattack to retake lost ground. Artillery became the backbone of this strategy, with carefully coordinated barrages designed to break up German attacks before they could reach French positions. The general understood that Verdun would not be won or lost in a single decisive battle, but through the accumulation of countless smaller actions. Each hill, each fort, each trench line would be contested with maximum violence. The Germans might advance, but they would pay in blood for every yard of ground. If Falkenhayn wanted a battle of attrition, Pétain would give him exactly that, but on terms that would favor the Sacred Way within the defenders. French reinforcements began arriving along days of Pétain's appointment. These were not the exhausted reserve units that had initially defended Verdun, but front-line divisions pulled from other sectors of the front. They came with modern equipment, adequate ammunition, and most importantly, the determination to hold ground that had become sacred to French national identity. The battle that had begun as a calculated German strategy to bleed France white was transforming into something far more complex and deadly. Both armies were now committed to a struggle that would test the very limits of human endurance. The hills around Verdun would become a laboratory where new forms of warfare were born in an atmosphere of unimaginable violence and suffering. The transformation of Verdun from a strategic objective into a symbol of national survival changed everything. What Falkenhayn had envisioned as a controlled bleeding of French forces became a mutual destruction that neither side could escape. The German Crown Prince Wilhelm found his Fifth Army locked into a battle that defied every principle of mobile warfare his father's generation had mastered. German attacks continued with mechanical precision through March and April, but the easy victories of the opening days were gone forever. French resistance stiffened with each passing week as Pétain's reorganization took hold. The artillery duels that raged across the scarred landscape consumed ammunition at rates that staggered supply officers on both sides. German guns fired over 2 million shells in the first 6 months alone, while French batteries responded with their own hurricane of steel and explosives. The physical landscape around Verdun began to resemble something from another planet. Aerial photographs showed a moonscape of overlapping craters where forests and farms had once flourished. Trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to splintered stumps. Villages disappeared entirely, their stones and timbers scattered by repeated bombardments until nothing remained to mark where human beings had once lived and worked. Individual battles within the larger struggle took on names that would haunt survivors for decades. Dead Man's Hill, Hill 304, Fleury Village, each became the focus of attacks and counterattacks that cost thousands of lives for gains measured in yards. Fleury itself changed hands 16 times during the battle, with each occupation leaving fewer buildings standing until finally nothing remained but rubble and corpses. The horror of Verdun lay not just in the scale of casualties, but in the nature of the killing itself. Artillery bombardments could last for days without pause, driving men insane with their relentless thunder. Soldiers learned to identify different types of shells by their sound as they approached. The whistle of high explosives, the buzz of shrapnel rounds, the sinister hiss of gas shells, each carried its own particular terror. French soldiers developed a grim humor about their situation. They called Verdun the mill or the meat grinder, acknowledging that men went in but did not come out unchanged, if they came out at all. Letters home spoke of landscapes where the dead outnumbered the living, where shell holes filled with rainwater turned pink from dissolved blood and flesh. Medical services collapsed under the weight of casualties that exceeded every previous calculation. Field hospitals operated in underground chambers, their surgeons working by candlelight while shells crashed overhead. Morphine ran short, then disappeared entirely. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia, while patients bit down on leather straps to muffle their screams. The psychological toll proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Shell shock, a condition barely recognized before the war, became epidemic among units that served extended tours at Verdun. Men who had shown courage in previous battles became cataleptic at the sound of distant gunfire. Others developed uncontrollable tremors that made it impossible to hold weapons or write letters home. German forces suffered their own special torments, as Falkenhayn's strategy trapped them in the same killing machine they had created for their enemies. Elite assault units that had spearheaded the initial attacks were ground down to nothing in repeated assaults against French positions that grew stronger each week. The Crown Prince Wilhelm, watching his divisions dissolve in the furnace of Verdun, began to question the wisdom of continuing attacks that gained little ground at enormous cost. By summer 1916, both armies had been bled nearly white, yet neither could disengage from the struggle. French national honor demanded that Verdun be held at any cost. German prestige required that the offensive succeed after such massive investments of men and material. The battle had developed its own momentum, consuming reinforcements as quickly as they could be fed into the line. The Sacred Way became more than a supply route. It became a pilgrimage route for French soldiers. Men marched north knowing they might never return, yet singing songs that spoke of duty and sacrifice. The road itself bore the scars of its service, its surface broken by constant traffic and enemy shelling, its shoulders lined with the graves of men who had died keeping it open. French artillery tactics evolved rapidly under the pressure of constant combat. Battery commanders learned to mass their fire with unprecedented precision, creating walls of steel that could stop German advances cold. Counter-battery fire became a deadly science, as observers learned to locate enemy guns by the flash of their muzzles and direct devastating responses within minutes. The introduction of new weapons added fresh dimensions of horror to an already hellish battlefield. Flamethrowers sprayed liquid fire into trenches and shell holes, turning human beings into living torches. Poison gas attacks became routine, forcing soldiers to fight while wearing masks that limited vision and breathing. Underground mining operations placed enormous charges beneath enemy positions, creating explosions that could be felt miles away. French morale, which had wavered during the initial German successes, began to strengthen as the battle dragged on without decisive German victory. Petain's promise that they shall not pass became more than a slogan. It became a sacred oath that bound together soldiers from across France. Units that had never served together before developed fierce loyalties forged in the crucible of shared suffering. The arrival of summer brought new challenges as heat combined with the stench of decomposing corpses to create conditions that tested human endurance beyond all previous limits. Water became more precious than ammunition as supply lines struggled to meet the needs of hundreds of thousands of men fighting in a wasteland where every natural source had been contaminated by chemical weapons or rotting flesh. German casualties mounted with each passing month as French defenses proved far more resilient than Falkenhayn had anticipated. The elite regiments that had begun the offensive as confident, well-trained formations were reduced to hollow shells filled with replacements who lacked the experience and motivation of the original troops. Unit cohesion, the foundation of military effectiveness, began to crumble under the grinding pressure of endless combat. By August, cracks appeared in the German High Command's confidence in the Verdun strategy. Reports from the Crown Prince Wilhelm painted an increasingly grim picture of an army trapped in a battle it could neither win nor abandon. Staff officers who had calculated French collapse within weeks now spoke of months or even years of continued fighting with no guarantee of success. The failure of repeated German assaults to break through French lines, despite enormous sacrifices, raised fundamental questions about Falkenhayn's strategy. Critics within the German army began to argue that the offensive had become exactly the kind of costly attrition battle that Germany, with its limited manpower reserves, could not afford to fight. The bloodletting at Verdun was draining German strength as rapidly as it was consuming French forces. Meanwhile, other fronts demanded attention and resources that were locked up in the Verdun offensive. The Brusilov offensive on the Eastern Front had shattered Austrian forces and threatened to knock Austria-Hungary out of the war entirely. The British offensive on the Somme, launched in July, created another massive drain on German reserves. Falkenhayn found himself fighting a multi-front war with insufficient forces to achieve decisive results anywhere. The strategic initiative, which Germany had seized with the opening bombardment in February, began to slip away as summer turned to autumn. French forces, their confidence restored by months of successful defense, began planning counter-offensives designed to recapture the ground lost in the opening phase of the battle. The hunter was becoming the hunted, as the balance of power shifted imperceptibly but decisively along the shell-torn ridges around Verdun. The guns finally fell silent on December 18th, 1916, after 302 days of unimaginable carnage. When the smoke cleared and the counting began, the numbers told a story that defied comprehension. 700,000 casualties, 300,000 dead, entire divisions erased from existence. The sacred ground around Verdun had consumed the equivalent of entire cities, leaving behind a wasteland so poisoned with unexploded shells and chemical residue that it remains dangerous over a century later. Falkenhayn's strategy to bleed France white had failed catastrophically, but not before bleeding Germany just as thoroughly. Both nations had fed their finest young men into the furnace of Verdun, and both emerged forever changed by the experience. The battle that was supposed to end the war had only made it longer and more terrible, proving that industrial warfare could consume entire generations without producing decisive victory. Yet from this hell emerged something that transcended military calculations. The French had held their ground not through superior strategy or overwhelming force, but through sheer determination. They had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. The phrase "they shall not pass" became more than words. It became the embodiment of a nation's refusal to surrender its soul. Today, the fields around Verdun remain a monument to human sacrifice and endurance. The red zone, where nothing can grow and no one can safely walk, stands as testimony to the terrible cost of modern war. In that blasted landscape lies a lesson that echoes across the decades. Some battles are won not by those who advance the furthest, but by those who refuse to yield when everything seems lost. The summer of 1916 brought with it something Europe had never witnessed before. On a stretch of rolling countryside in northern France, where the River Somme meandered peacefully, through farmland and villages, the most catastrophic single day in British military history was about to unfold. What happened on July 1st would shatter not just the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but the very soul of a nation. This is the story of how one morning's attack became a massacre, so complete, so devastating, that it would forever change the way the world understood the true cost of war. 60,000 casualties in a single day. 19,000 dead before the sun had reached its peak. Entire neighborhoods back home would be wiped out by telegram after telegram, bearing the worst possible news. Fathers, sons, brothers and friends who had marched off to war together would never return home. The Somme wasn't just a battle, it was the day hope died on the Western Front. To understand how this catastrophe unfolded, we need to step back into the minds of the men who planned it. The year 1916 had begun with grand ambitions. After nearly 2 years of deadlock in the muddy hell of trench warfare, the Allied commanders believed they had found the key to victory. A massive coordinated assault that would finally break the German lines and end the war. They called it the Big Push. What they got instead was the big tragedy. The architect of this disaster was Field Marshal Douglas Haig, a man whose name would become synonymous with military incompetence and senseless slaughter. Yet in the spring of 1916, Haig was confident, even optimistic. He had inherited a plan that promised to coordinate attacks across multiple fronts. Russia would strike in the east, Italy would press from the south, and Britain and France would deliver the knockout blow on the western front along the River Somme. The location wasn't chosen for its strategic value. No vital railways to capture, no crucial ports to seize. The Somme was selected for one simple reason. It was where the British and French armies stood side by side. After bearing the brunt of the fighting since 1914, the French were determined to see their British allies contribute their fair share to the bloodshed. What they didn't anticipate was how much blood would be spilled. The plan seemed foolproof on paper. British artillery would unleash the most devastating bombardment in military history. For 7 straight days, the guns would pound German positions with over 1.5 million shells. The constant thunder would be so intense it could be heard across the English Channel in London. Surely, the planners reasoned, no human being could survive such an apocalyptic barrage. When the shells stopped falling, British infantry would simply walk across no man's land and occupy the shattered German trenches. They were catastrophically wrong. What the British commanders failed to understand was that their enemy had been preparing for this moment for nearly 2 years. While British soldiers shivered in waterlogged trenches, German engineers had been digging, not just trenches, but underground cities. These were elaborate fortifications, some 40 feet beneath the earth, complete with electric lighting, kitchens, and comfortable sleeping quarters. When British shells began to fall, German soldiers simply disappeared underground, waiting patiently in their concrete bunkers for the storm to pass. The bombardment that was supposed to destroy German defenses had another fatal flaw. 2/3 of those 1.5 million shells were shrapnel rounds, designed to kill men in the open, not destroy fortified positions. British munitions factories were producing defective ammunition. It's estimated that nearly 1 in 3 shells failed to explode entirely. The barbed wire that was supposed to be blown apart remained largely intact, creating deadly tangles that would trap attacking soldiers like fish in a net. The most tragic element of this disaster was the men who would pay the ultimate price for their commanders' miscalculations. These weren't the hardened professional soldiers of Britain's small peacetime army. Those men had been largely wiped out. Instead, the Somme would be fought by Kitchener's new army, volunteers who had answered their country's call with patriotic enthusiasm. Among these volunteers were some of the most remarkable units in British military history, the PALS battalions. When recruitment began in 1914, local communities had been promised that friends, neighbors, and workmates could serve together. Entire football teams enlisted as one. Factory workers joined with their colleagues. University students marched to war alongside their classmates. The idea seemed brilliant for morale. Men would fight harder knowing their mates were beside them. The reality would prove heartbreaking beyond measure. Take the Accrington PALS, drawn from a small Lancashire town. 720 men had volunteered together, trained together, and crossed the Channel together. They represented the pride of their community. On July 1st, they would attack the village of Serres at the northern end of the British assault. Within 20 minutes of going over the top, 584 of them would be casualties. 235 would never see home again. The Sheffield City Battalion, nicknamed the Sheffield PALS, were drawn from the steel workers and craftsmen who had built Britain's industrial might. 495 would fall in a single morning's attack. The Leeds PALS lost 750 of their 900 participants. The Grimsby Chums were cut down in waves. Entire streets back home would receive telegrams on the same day. Entire neighborhoods would go into mourning simultaneously. This wasn't just military defeat. This was social catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. As dawn broke on July 1st, 1916, the British artillery fell silent for the first time in 7 days. In the sudden quiet, German soldiers emerged from their underground shelters, brushed off the concrete dust, and manned their machine guns. They peered across no man's land through the morning mist and could hardly believe what they saw. Long lines of British soldiers, laden down with heavy equipment, walking slowly and deliberately toward their positions, not running, not taking cover, but walking in neat, orderly rows as if they were on a parade ground rather than a battlefield. The British battle plan was based on the assumption that there would be no organized resistance left after the bombardment. Soldiers were ordered to advance at walking pace to maintain formation. They carried 60 pounds of equipment each, including tools to consolidate captured trenches. Many commanders, doubtful that these civilian volunteers could handle complex tactics, had ordered them to advance in rigid lines with precise intervals between each man. The German machine gunners couldn't miss. As the first waves of British infantry approached the German wire, which remained largely uncut despite the week-long bombardment, the slaughter began. Machine guns that were supposed to have been destroyed opened fire from concealed positions. Artillery that should have been silenced rained shells down on the attacking formations. Men who had walked confidently from their trenches expecting an easy victory instead walked into the most devastating defensive fire in military history. The carnage was so complete, so overwhelming, that some German machine gunners reportedly stopped firing out of sheer horror at what they were witnessing. But the British kept coming. Wave after wave of men climbing out of their trenches, walking into the storm of steel, and falling by the thousands. By the end of that terrible day, the British Army had suffered 57,000 casualties. 19,240 men had been killed. It remains the bloodiest single day in British military history. The big push had advanced just a few hundred yards in most places, nowhere near the breakthrough that had been promised. The war that was supposed to end by Christmas 1914 would drag on for 2 more agonizing years, but the true tragedy of the Somme wasn't just measured in casualty statistics. It was measured in the destruction of an entire generation's faith in their leaders, their cause, and their future. The flower of British youth had been cut down in a single morning, and the scars would last for generations. The aftermath of that first catastrophic day revealed the true horror of what had transpired. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the sounds of wounded men crying out from no man's land filled the night air. Stretcher bearers worked frantically to retrieve the injured, but thousands lay beyond reach in the deadly ground between the trenches. Some would remain there for days, slowly dying of their wounds, while German and British snipers made rescue attempts impossible. Back in Britain, the telegraph wires hummed with devastating news. The War Office had prepared for casualties, but nothing on this scale. Telegraph operators worked through the night, sending thousands upon thousands of notifications to families across the country. In Accrington, the postmen refused to deliver the telegrams, knowing that each envelope contained news that would destroy a family. In Sheffield, entire streets fell silent as neighbors realized that their local battalion had been virtually wiped out. The newspapers, still bound by wartime censorship, could only hint at the scale of the disaster. Headlines spoke of successful operations and ground gained, but the casualty lists told a different story. Page after page of names, photographs of young men who would never return home. The Accrington Observer and Times ran story after story of local heroes who had fallen. Percy Holmes, whose brother had served with the PALs, remembered the day the news reached home. The entire town seemed to go into collective mourning. What made the tragedy even more bitter was how preventable it had been. Military experts on both sides had warned about the futility of frontal assaults against prepared positions. The German army had learned these lessons through bitter experience at Verdun, where they had discovered that artillery alone could never completely suppress determined defenders. Yet British commanders had ignored these warnings, convinced that their massive bombardment would succeed where others had failed. The German defenders themselves were shocked by the slaughter they had witnessed. Many had expected the British attack to be called off when it became clear that the bombardment had failed. Lieutenant Colonel Badal of the German 169th Infantry Regiment later wrote that his men were horrified by the sight of British soldiers walking into certain death. Some German units actually ceased firing, unable to continue the massacre of such brave but misguided men. But the most damning evidence of the day's futility came from the few places where British forces had achieved success. On the southern end of the attack, where French forces had coordinated more effectively with their artillery, Significant gains were made with relatively light casualties. The French had learned to use their guns more precisely, targeting specific strongpoints rather than conducting the broad bombardment favored by the British. Their infantry advanced in small groups, using cover and speed rather than the rigid lines that had proven so disastrous elsewhere. These tactical successes were ignored by British High Command. Instead of learning from the day's lessons, Field Marshal Haig doubled down on his strategy of attrition. The battle would continue for months, each day bringing fresh casualties for minimal gains. The Somme had become a meat grinder, consuming entire divisions for the sake of a few hundred yards of cratered mud. The psychological impact on the survivors was perhaps as devastating as the physical casualties. Men who had witnessed their friends and brothers cut down in minutes struggled to understand how such carnage could have been ordered by their own commanders. The blind faith that had characterized British soldiers in the early years of the war began to crumble. Letters home spoke not of glory and heroism, but of waste and futility. Private Arthur Wrench of the London Scottish wrote to his family describing the aftermath of the attack. He had watched entire companies disappear into the smoke and chaos, never to return. The ground was so thick with bodies that survivors had to step carefully to avoid treading on the dead. The smell of death hung over the battlefield for weeks, a constant reminder of the day's horror. The medical services, already stretched to breaking point, were completely overwhelmed. Field hospitals designed to handle hundreds of wounded were suddenly faced with tens of thousands of casualties. Doctors worked without rest, performing surgery by candlelight when the electric generators failed. Many wounded men died not from their injuries, but from the simple lack of medical attention. The lucky ones were evacuated to hospitals in England, but even there the scale of suffering was unprecedented. Among the wounded were men who would carry the physical and mental scars of July 1st for the rest of their lives. Shell shock, then barely understood by military doctors, affected thousands of survivors. Men who had shown incredible courage under fire found themselves unable to function in civilian life, haunted by memories of friends dying beside them. The term survivor's guilt had not yet been coined, but the condition was all too real. The families left behind faced their own struggles. Widows suddenly found themselves alone with children to raise and no income to support them. The government's pension system was inadequate for the scale of loss. Entire communities had to band together to support the families of the fallen. In Accrington, a fund was established to help the widows and orphans of the PALs, but no amount of money could fill the void left by so many lost fathers and husbands. The class system that had defined British society was also shattered by the Somme. The idea that upper-class officers would lead working-class men to glorious victory had been exposed as a deadly delusion. Many of the PAL's battalions had been led by local businessmen and aristocrats who had bought their commissions rather than earning them through military training. These amateur soldiers, however well-intentioned, had lacked the tactical knowledge to adapt when their plans went wrong. Yet even as the immediate horror of July 1st sank in, the battle continued. Haig, rather than acknowledging the failure of his tactics, ordered more attacks. The logic of attrition demanded that British forces continue pressing forward, grinding down German reserves even at enormous cost to themselves. Each day brought fresh casualties, fresh grief for families across Britain and the Commonwealth. The Somme had become a symbol of everything wrong with the conduct of the war. Politicians who had promised swift victory were now forced to explain why the flower of British youth was being sacrificed for a few yards of French countryside. The public began to question not just the competence of their military leaders, but the very purpose of the war itself. The questions that had seemed so simple in 1914 now appeared impossibly complex. What were British soldiers dying for? Was the capture of a few miles of devastated French farmland worth the destruction of an entire generation? The answers that had satisfied politicians and generals in the comfortable safety of London seemed hollow to the men rotting in the trenches of the Somme. As the weeks dragged on after that catastrophic first day, the true scope of the disaster began to emerge. The casualty reports that trickled back to London painted a picture so grim that many officials simply refused to believe them. How could a single day's fighting have cost more lives than some entire campaigns of previous wars? How could the most powerful military force in British history have been so completely outmaneuvered by an enemy that was supposedly on the brink of collapse? The answer lay in the fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare that had plagued Allied commanders since the beginning of the conflict. They were fighting a 20th century war with 19th century tactics, sending men armed with rifles and bayonets against machine guns and artillery. The romantic notion of cavalry charges and glorious infantry assaults had been rendered obsolete by industrial killing machines that could mow down hundreds of men in minutes. Yet the lessons of July 1st were ignored by those in command. Field Marshal Haig, rather than accepting responsibility for the disaster, instead blamed his subordinates and the quality of his troops. In his dispatches to London, he claimed that the attack had achieved its objectives, that German resistance was weakening, and that victory was just around the corner. The reality on the ground told a very different story. The men who had survived the opening assault found themselves trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end. The German positions that were supposed to have been obliterated by the bombardment remained largely intact. Machine gun nests that should have been silenced continued to rake the British lines with deadly fire. Artillery positions that were meant to be destroyed kept raining shells down on anyone who dared to move in daylight. The no-man's land between the opposing trenches became a hellscape of shell holes and rotting corpses. Bodies of British soldiers lay scattered across the battlefield, some hanging on the uncut wire like grotesque scarecrows. The summer heat accelerated decomposition, creating a stench so overwhelming that even hardened veterans were sickened. Gas masks, originally designed to protect against chemical weapons, became necessary just to breathe near the front lines. Supply lines that had been planned to support a rapid advance instead became death traps. Every attempt to bring food, ammunition, or medical supplies to the forward positions was met with devastating fire from German observers who had clear views of the British rear areas. Men went days without hot food, surviving on cold rations and contaminated water. Wounded soldiers lay in shell holes for hours or even days before stretcher bearers could reach them, if they could be reached at all. The psychological toll was perhaps even more devastating than the physical casualties. Men who had enlisted with dreams of heroic adventure found themselves living like rats in flooded holes in the ground. The camaraderie that had sustained the PALS battalions through training and the journey to France was shattered by the random nature of death on the battlefield. Friends who had shared jokes over breakfast were corpses by lunchtime. Brothers who had promised their mothers they would look after each other were separated forever by a few yards of blood-soaked earth. Shell shock, a condition that military doctors barely understood, began to claim victims by the thousands. Men who had shown incredible bravery under fire suddenly found themselves unable to stop shaking. Veterans who had survived months of trench warfare broke down completely after witnessing the slaughter of July 1st. Some were court-martialed for cowardice. Others were quietly evacuated to hospitals where they stared blankly at walls, unable to speak about what they had seen. The home front was equally devastated by the continuing casualties. The initial shock of July 1st had been terrible enough, but as the battle dragged on through July, August and September, the steady stream of death notifications never seemed to end. Families who had already mourned one son received word that another had fallen. Wives who had lost husbands discovered that their brothers or fathers had also been killed. Entire family lines were wiped out in the space of a few weeks. The economic impact was equally severe. Britain's industrial towns, already struggling with wartime production demands, lost thousands of skilled workers to the Somme. Factories that had been converted to munitions production found themselves short-staffed as their most experienced employees were reported missing or killed in action. The very men who had built Britain's industrial might were being consumed by the war machine they had helped create. The class divisions that had defined British society for centuries began to break down under the weight of shared grief. Working-class families who had lost sons in the PALS battalions found themselves mourning alongside upper-class families whose officer sons had been killed, leading the same doomed attacks. The traditional deference to authority that had characterized British society was replaced by bitter questioning of the decisions that had led to such carnage. Religious faith, which had sustained many families through the early years of the war, began to crack under the strain of inexplicable loss. How could a benevolent God allow such suffering? What divine plan could justify the sacrifice of an entire generation? Churches that had been packed with congregations praying for victory found themselves struggling to explain why those prayers seemed to go unanswered. Some clergy abandoned their posts, unable to reconcile their faith with the reality of industrial slaughter. The propaganda machine that had sustained public support for the war effort began to lose its effectiveness. Posters showing heroic soldiers charging toward glorious victory rang hollow when compared to the letters arriving from the front lines. Newspaper accounts of strategic successes could not mask the endless casualty lists that filled page after page. The gap between official accounts and lived reality became too wide to bridge with patriotic rhetoric. Musicians and poets who had once celebrated the romance of warfare began to produce works of a very different character. The jingoistic songs that had filled music halls in 1914 gave way to haunting melodies that captured the sorrow of a nation in mourning. Poetry that had once glorified military service now spoke of waste, futility, and the betrayal of youth by age. The cultural landscape of Britain was being reshaped by the reality of mechanized death. Medical advances that had been driven by necessity began to change how society understood injury and trauma. Prosthetic limbs, once crude and uncomfortable, were refined to help the thousands of amputees returning from France. Plastic surgery, still in its infancy, developed rapidly as doctors struggled to rebuild faces destroyed by shrapnel and bullets. Mental health treatment, previously focused on restraint and confinement, began to evolve as the scale of psychological casualties became impossible to ignore. The women left behind were forced to take on roles that had previously been exclusively male domains. Factories, farms, and offices that had lost their male workers to the trenches were staffed by wives, daughters, and sisters who proved just as capable as the men they replaced. This social transformation, born of necessity and tragedy, would have lasting implications far beyond the war itself. The rigid gender roles that had defined Victorian society were crumbling along with everything else. The empire that had sent men from across the globe to fight on the Somme was also being transformed by the experience. Canadian, Australian, South African, and Indian units that had fought alongside British troops brought home stories of incompetent leadership and senseless sacrifice. The blind loyalty to the mother country that had characterized colonial attitudes began to give way to more critical assessments of British leadership. The seeds of future independence movements were being planted in the mud of northern France. Even the German forces, despite their tactical success in repelling the British attacks, were deeply affected by what they had witnessed. Many German soldiers wrote home about the bravery of their British opponents, expressing admiration for men who had walked into certain death with such discipline and courage. The mechanical nature of the killing, the industrial scale of the slaughter, troubled veterans on both sides who had entered the war expecting something resembling traditional combat. As autumn approached and the battle finally began to wind down, both sides could look back on months of fighting that had achieved virtually nothing except the destruction of human life on an unprecedented scale. The strategic objectives that had justified the offensive remained unrealized. The German lines, though battered, remained intact. The breakthrough that would end the war was as elusive as ever. All that had been accomplished was the transformation of a generation of young men into statistics in history books. The lessons of the Somme would eventually reshape military doctrine, but not before millions more would die in similar attacks. The combination of outdated tactics and modern weapons that had proven so deadly on July 1st would continue to claim victims until the very end of the war. The price of military education was being paid in human lives, and the tuition was higher than any civilization had ever been asked to bear. The Somme stands today not as a monument to military genius, but as a testament to the terrible cost of human folly. July 1st, 1916, changed everything. It shattered the illusion that war was glorious, that sacrifice was always meaningful, that leaders were infallible. In a single morning, 19,000 young men died for gains that could be measured in yards rather than miles. The big push became the big tragedy, and Britain would never be the same. The fields of northern France still hold the echoes of that catastrophic day. Walk through the Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries that dot the landscape, and you'll find row upon row of headstones marking lives cut short by decisions made in comfortable rooms far from the front lines. These were not just soldiers. They were sons, fathers, brothers, friends. They were the Accrington Pals, the Sheffield City Battalion, the Leeds Pals. They were an entire generation that trusted their leaders and paid the ultimate price for that trust. The Somme reminds us that the true cost of war is not measured in strategic objectives achieved or territory gained. It's measured in the tears of mothers who never saw their sons again, in the silence of streets where laughter once echoed, in the dreams that died with the dreamers. July 1st, 1916 was indeed the bloodiest day in history. But more than that, it was the day innocence died and the modern world was born in blood and mud. In the pre-dawn darkness of April 25th, 1915, thousands of young men from the far reaches of the British Empire prepared for what they believed would be a swift and glorious campaign. Australian and New Zealand soldiers, many who had never seen combat, gripped their rifles with sweating palms as their boats cut through the black waters toward the Turkish coast. They had been told this would be easy. A quick strike against the crumbling Ottoman Empire, a rapid advance to capture Constantinople, and the war would be over by Christmas. But as the first light of dawn broke over the Gallipoli Peninsula, these brave souls were about to discover the brutal reality of modern warfare against an enemy who would fight with desperate fury for every inch of their homeland. What followed was not victory, but 8 months of unimaginable carnage that would claim 250,000 lives on each side. This is the story of how Allied ambition collided with Ottoman determination in one of the most catastrophic military disasters of the First World War. The beaches would run red with blood, the trenches would overflow with corpses, and from this hellish nightmare would emerge legends that still echo through the corridors of history. By 1915, the Great War had descended into a stalemate of unprecedented brutality. Across the muddy fields of France and Belgium, millions of men faced each other from opposing trenches, their advance measured not in miles but in yards, soaked with blood. The Western Front had become a meat grinder, consuming entire generations while the front lines barely shifted. In London, the War Cabinet desperately searched for a breakthrough, a way to break the deadlock that was bleeding their empire dry. Winston Churchill, the ambitious First Lord of the Admiralty, believed he had found the answer. His eyes turned eastward, toward the narrow straits that connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. The Dardanelles, controlled by the Ottoman Empire, held the key to a bold new strategy. If British and French warships could force these waters, they could sail directly to Constantinople, the heart of the Ottoman Empire. The capture of the Turkish capital would not only knock Germany's ally out of the war, but would also open a vital supply route to Russia, Britain's struggling ally in the east. The plan seemed brilliant on paper. The Ottoman Empire was widely regarded as the sick man of Europe, its armies outdated, its defenses crumbling. Surely a modern European fleet could brush aside whatever resistance the Turks might offer. This would be the masterstroke that ended the war, the daring operation that would be remembered as the moment Britain seized victory from the jaws of stalemate. But Churchill and his generals had made a fatal miscalculation. They had underestimated their enemy. The Ottoman Empire may have been weakened by years of conflict, but its soldiers possessed something the Allied planners had failed to account for. They were fighting for their homeland. And leading their defense was a brilliant young officer whose tactical genius would turn the beaches of Gallipoli into a graveyard for Allied ambitions. Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal had studied the Gallipoli Peninsula during the recent Balkan Wars. Unlike the confident Allied commanders planning their assault from comfortable headquarters, Kemal knew every ridge, every gully, every strategic height that dominated the coastline. He had predicted exactly where the British would attempt their landings, and he had prepared accordingly. As Churchill's naval forces began their preliminary bombardment of the Turkish forts guarding the Dardanelles in February 1915, they met with unexpected resistance. The Turkish shore batteries, supported by German military advisors, fought back with savage effectiveness. Mines sank Allied warships, and the narrow straits became a killing ground where British and French vessels struggled against an enemy that refused to collapse. The naval assault that was supposed to clear the way to Constantinople had failed miserably. But rather than abandon the operation, the Allied leadership doubled down on their commitment. If the fleet could not force the straits alone, Then troops would have to land on the Gallipoli Peninsula to silence the guns and clear the minefields. What had begun as a naval operation now became an amphibious assault of staggering complexity. The forces assembled for this invasion represented the flower of the British Empire. From Australia and New Zealand came the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the ANZACs, young volunteers who had travelled halfway around the world to fight for king and country. British regulars, battle-hardened veterans of colonial campaigns, would spearhead the main assault at Cape Helles. French colonial troops would support the operation, adding their strength to what commanders believed would be an overwhelming force. 16,000 Australian and New Zealand soldiers prepared for their baptism of fire. Most had never heard a shot fired in anger, but they possessed the confidence of youth and the certainty that their cause was just. They had trained in the deserts of Egypt, dreaming of glory and adventure. As their transport ships approached the Turkish coast in the darkness before dawn, they whispered prayers and checked their equipment one final time. The plan called for multiple simultaneous landings that would overwhelm Turkish defenses and establish secure beachheads from which to advance inland. The ANZACs were to land at Gaba Tepe, a relatively gentle stretch of coastline where they could quickly move inland and capture the high ground. British forces would assault the heavily fortified positions at Cape Helles, drawing Turkish reserves away from the ANZAC sector. It was a complex operation that required precise timing, effective communication, and more than a little luck. But as the first boats approached the Turkish shore, everything that could go wrong began to go wrong. Strong currents pushed the ANZAC landing craft north of their intended target. Instead of the gentle beaches they had expected, the Australians and New Zealanders found themselves approaching a coastline dominated by steep cliffs and narrow ravines. The terrain that was supposed to aid their advance had become their first enemy. As the boats scraped against the rocky shore, Turkish sentries spotted the invasion fleet. The alarm was raised, and within minutes, rifle fire began crackling from the heights above the landing beaches. The element of surprise, crucial to any amphibious operation, had been lost before the first soldier set foot on Turkish soil. Mustafa Kemal, sleeping in his headquarters several miles inland, was awakened by the sound of gunfire echoing across the peninsula. While other Turkish commanders debated whether this was the main assault or merely a feint, Kemal acted with decisive speed. He had been preparing for this moment for months, and he knew that the next few hours would determine the fate of his homeland. Racing toward the sound of battle, Kemal encountered units of the 57th Infantry Regiment moving toward the coast. These were ordinary Turkish soldiers, many of them farmers and craftsmen who had been called to defend their country. They were poorly equipped compared to their enemies, some fighting in worn boots or even barefoot, but their eyes burned with the determination of men defending their homes. Kemal's words to these soldiers would become legendary in Turkish military history. He did not promise them victory or glory. Instead, he told them the brutal truth about what he was asking of them. The enemy had landed in force, and only immediate sacrifice could prevent the collapse of the entire defensive line. The race for the high ground had begun, and upon its outcome hung the fate of empires. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain as the first ANZAC soldiers stumbled ashore, their boots slipping on wet rocks as Turkish bullets whistled overhead. What should have been a coordinated landing had devolved into chaos. Men scattered for cover behind boulders and scrub, their carefully rehearsed battle plans forgotten in the face of withering fire from positions they could barely see. The Australians who managed to crest the initial ridge found themselves face to face with Turkish reinforcements rushing toward the sound of battle. These were not the demoralized conscripts the Allied intelligence reports had described. They were determined fighters who knew every fold in the ground, every defensive position that could shelter them from the naval bombardment that had begun pounding the heights. Private after private fell as the ANZACs pushed inland, their khaki uniforms stark against the Mediterranean scrubland. The wounded cried out for medics who were themselves pinned down by sniper fire. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the thunder of artillery and the crack of rifle volleys. Within hours of landing, the narrow beachhead was littered with the bodies of young men who had sailed from Sydney and Auckland, dreaming of adventure. But the horror at what would become known as ANZAC Cove was only beginning. As Mustafa Kemal's 57th Regiment moved into position on the heights above, they carried with them not just rifles and ammunition, but the weight of a civilization's survival. These Turkish soldiers understood that failure here meant the fall of Constantinople, the end of their empire, and the subjugation of their people. They would not yield ground lightly. The initial Turkish counterattack came with the fury of men fighting for their existence. Kemal himself led from the front, his sword drawn as he urged his soldiers forward into the maelstrom of fire and steel. The 57th Regiment, which had begun the day at full strength, threw itself against the ANZAC positions with such ferocity that entire companies were wiped out in minutes. Turkish soldiers charged through their own artillery barrages, bayonets fixed, determined to drive the invaders back into the sea. The fighting devolved into a series of desperate melees fought across ground that changed hands multiple times within hours. Australian light horse troopers, trained to fight mounted on the open plains, found themselves scrambling up cliff faces with rifles and bayonets. New Zealand infantry, their ranks thinning with every advance, pushed toward strategic ridges, only to be met by Turkish defenders who seemed to materialize from the very earth itself. By midday, the carefully planned assault had become a nightmare of improvisation and survival. The ANZAC forces, instead of advancing rapidly inland to capture their objectives, found themselves clinging to a precarious foothold, barely 500 yards deep. Every attempt to expand the beachhead was met by fierce resistance from Turkish positions that commanded the entire landing area. The casualties were staggering. Medical stations established behind the beach became overwhelmed with wounded men, their groans mixing with the continuous roar of battle. Stretcher-bearers worked under fire, dragging their comrades to safety, while Turkish snipers picked off anyone who showed themselves above the minimal cover. The pristine waters of the Mediterranean began to turn red as bodies floated in the surf. Meanwhile, at Cape Helles on the southern tip of the peninsula, British forces faced their own catastrophe. The 29th Division, composed of regular army veterans, had been tasked with seizing the heavily fortified positions guarding the entrance to the Dardanelles. These were not the improvised defenses the ANZACs had encountered, but carefully prepared killing grounds where Turkish machine gunners waited behind concrete emplacements and barbed wire obstacles. The landing at V Beach became a slaughter that defied comprehension. British soldiers poured from the converted collier River Clyde directly into the muzzles of Turkish guns that had been pre-positioned to cover every yard of the narrow beach. Men fell in waves, their bodies piling up in the shallow water as subsequent waves of attackers struggled over the corpses of their comrades. Colonel Doughty Wiley, leading the assault with nothing but a walking stick, became one of the few to reach the Turkish trenches alive. His death in the hand-to-hand fighting that followed epitomized the courage and futility that characterized the entire operation. For every yard gained, dozens of lives were lost, and the strategic objectives that had seemed so achievable in the planning stages remained tantalizingly out of reach. As night fell on April 25th, the Allied commanders faced the brutal reality of their situation. Instead of the swift advance that would open the road to Constantinople, they held a series of isolated beachheads under constant fire from commanding Turkish positions. The Ottoman defenders, far from collapsing under the weight of modern European military might, had demonstrated a tactical sophistication and fighting spirit that had caught the invaders completely off guard. Mustafa Kemal, surveying the battlefield from his command post, recognized that the critical moment had arrived. The enemy landings had been contained, but barely. His own forces had suffered enormous casualties in the day's fighting, with entire battalions reduced to company strength. The 57th Regiment, which had borne the brunt of the counterattack, had virtually ceased to exist as a fighting unit, but they had bought precious time for reinforcements to arrive and defensive positions to be strengthened. The Turkish commander understood that the next few days would determine whether the Allied invasion could be crushed completely or whether it would establish the foothold necessary for a prolonged campaign. He ordered his surviving units to dig in along the ridges overlooking the landing beaches, creating a network of trenches and strongpoints that would turn every Allied advance into a costly assault against prepared positions. As dawn broke on April 26th, both sides began the grim work of consolidating their positions. The ANZACs, their initial enthusiasm tempered by the reality of modern warfare, scraped shallow trenches in the rocky soil, while Turkish snipers made every movement a gamble with death. The wounded who had survived the night called out for water that could not be safely delivered. The dead lay scattered across no man's land, already beginning to bloat in the Mediterranean Sunday. The Gallipoli campaign had begun with dreams of swift victory and strategic breakthrough. Instead, it had produced a miniature version of the Western Front, complete with opposing trench systems, deadly no man's land, and the promise of prolonged slaughter. The Ottoman Empire had passed its first test, but the real ordeal was only beginning. The summer heat of 1915 transformed Gallipoli into a living hell that defied human endurance. As temperatures soared above 100 degrees, the narrow confines of the Allied beachheads became death traps where men fought not only Turkish bullets but disease, thirst, and the overwhelming stench of decomposing flesh. The bodies of those who had fallen during the initial landings lay scattered across no man's land, bloating grotesquely under the merciless Sunday. Clouds of black flies, breeding in the countless corpses, swarmed over everything, making eating a torturous ordeal as soldiers tried to consume their meager rations while swatting away insects that had fed on rotting human flesh. In the trenches that now scarred the landscape, men lived like rats in holes barely deep enough to provide cover from Turkish snipers who waited patiently for any target to present itself. Water became more precious than gold, with every drop having to be carried up from the beaches under constant enemy fire. Dysentery ravaged the Allied ranks, turning strong young soldiers into hollow-eyed wraiths who could barely hold their rifles. The latrines overflowed, contaminating the limited water supplies and creating a cycle of disease that claimed more lives than Turkish bullets. Turkish defenders faced their own nightmare of survival. Many fought barefoot, their boots long since worn through by the rocky terrain. Their uniforms, originally field grey or khaki, had faded to the color of dust and were patched with material torn from sandbags and strips of cloth salvaged from enemy dead. Food supplies were irregular at best, with soldiers sometimes going days without a proper meal. When wounded Turkish fighters were evacuated from the front lines, the journey to medical facilities could take 8 to 10 hours over treacherous mountain paths, and many died during the agonizing transport. Yet, despite these horrific conditions, the fighting continued with undiminished fury. Every night brought raids as both sides attempted to improve their positions or gather intelligence about enemy strength. Soldiers crept through the darkness, crawling over ground littered with corpses, their faces blackened with mud and blood. The proximity of the opposing trenches, sometimes separated by mere yards, created a psychological pressure that drove men to the edge of madness. Conversations could be heard across no man's land, and occasionally, enemy soldiers would shout insults or challenges to their opponents. The August offensive represented the Allied commanders' final desperate gamble to break the deadlock that had consumed thousands of lives while achieving virtually nothing. Reinforcements poured into the peninsula, swelling the invasion force to 11 divisions. Fresh troops from Britain arrived with the same naive confidence that had characterized the original ANZAC landings, only to discover that Gallipoli had become a charnel house where tactical objectives were measured in yards and paid for in blood. The plan called for a coordinated assault that would finally shatter Turkish resistance through sheer weight of numbers and simultaneous attacks at multiple points. A new landing at Suvla Bay would establish a fresh beachhead north of the existing ANZAC positions, while diversionary attacks at Cape Helles would draw Turkish reserves away from the main effort. The centerpiece of the operation was an assault on the Sari Bear Ridge, the commanding heights that overlooked the entire peninsula and held the key to strategic victory. But Mustafa Kemal had spent the intervening months preparing for exactly this eventuality. The Turkish defenses had been strengthened and expanded into a comprehensive network of mutually supporting positions. Machine gun nests commanded every approach route, while artillery observers on the heights could direct devastating fire onto any concentration of attacking troops. More critically, Bulgarian entry into the war had opened direct supply lines between Germany and the Ottoman Empire, allowing modern artillery and experienced crews to reinforce the Turkish positions. The assault began before dawn on August 6th, with a thunderous artillery barrage that lit the sky like a man-made sunrise. British and French guns pounded the Turkish trenches for hours, hurling thousands of shells into positions that seemed to disappear under clouds of smoke and flying earth. Allied commanders watched through their field glasses, convinced that no human being could survive such devastation. Surely this time, the Turkish resistance would crumble and the road to Constantinople would finally open. But as the barrage lifted and waves of infantry advanced across the broken ground, Turkish defenders emerged from deep bunkers and communication tunnels that had protected them from the worst of the bombardment. Machine guns that had been silenced moments before suddenly erupted back to life, cutting down attacking soldiers in swaths. The carefully coordinated assault dissolved into the same chaotic nightmare that had characterized every previous attempt to break the Turkish lines. At Lone Pine, Australian forces managed to capture the Turkish frontline trenches after fierce hand-to-hand combat that left hundreds dead on both sides. But the position they had won at such enormous cost proved to be merely an outpost. The main Turkish defensive line lay hundreds of yards further back, completely intact and ready to pour fire into any attempt to advance. The Australians found themselves trapped in captured trenches that had become death traps, unable to advance or retreat while Turkish counterattacks pressed in from all sides. The horror reached its crescendo at a narrow saddle of ground called the Neck, where Australian light horse regiments were ordered to conduct a frontal assault against Turkish positions that commanded perfect fields of fire. The attack was supposed to be preceded by artillery support that would suppress the enemy machine guns, but a timing error left the charging horsemen completely exposed to defensive fire that had not been disrupted. Wave after wave of light horsemen rose from their trenches and charged across the open ground, their swords drawn in a gesture that belonged to another century. Turkish machine gunners, positioned in concrete emplacements, cut them down with methodical precision, bodies piled up in neat rows, as each successive wave met the same fate as those who had gone before. In less than 30 minutes, entire regiments had been destroyed, while gaining not a single yard of ground. The New Zealand assault on Chunuk Bair initially met with greater success. Maori and European troops, fighting side by side, managed to scale the steep ravines and capture portions of the ridge that had been the objective of every Allied attack since April. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the breakthrough had finally been achieved. From the summit, New Zealand officers could see the Dardanelles Strait stretching toward Constantinople, the prize that had cost so many lives. But Mustafa Kemal, arriving at the scene with characteristic speed and decisiveness, immediately recognized the mortal threat that the New Zealand success represented. If the Allies could hold Chunuk Bair, their artillery observers would command the entire peninsula, making every Turkish position untenable. He ordered an immediate counterattack, personally leading his men forward with nothing but bayonets fixed, knowing that conventional tactics would take too long. The fighting for the summit became a melee of unprecedented savagery. Men fought with bayonets, rifle butts, rocks, and bare hands across ground so steep that corpses rolled down the slopes. The New Zealanders, exhausted by their night-long climb and outnumbered by the Turkish reinforcements, fought with desperate courage but could not maintain their grip on the vital heights. As dawn broke, Turkish soldiers had retaken the ridge, leaving it carpeted with the bodies of both armies. The simultaneous landing at Suvla Bay, which was supposed to provide the decisive advantage through fresh troops and a secure base of operations, degenerated into farce through incompetent leadership and missed opportunities. British forces came ashore virtually unopposed, facing only scattered resistance from Turkish outposts. The beaches were secured quickly, and for once, an Allied landing had achieved its immediate tactical objectives without catastrophic casualties. But the British commanders, perhaps traumatized by the disasters they had witnessed elsewhere on the peninsula, failed to exploit their success. Instead of pushing rapidly inland to seize the commanding heights before Turkish reinforcements could arrive, they spent precious hours consolidating their beachhead and organizing supply lines. The delay proved fatal to any chance of strategic success. Turkish reserves, rushed from other sectors of the peninsula, arrived just in time to occupy the hills overlooking Suvla Bay. When the British finally advanced inland, they found the high ground already fortified and defended by troops who had learned bitter lessons from 4 months of combat against Allied forces. What should have been a breakthrough became another bloody stalemate, with British soldiers dying in the same futile frontal assaults that had characterized the entire campaign. As the August offensive ground to a halt in failure and exhaustion, both sides faced the grim reality that the campaign had become a war of attrition that neither could afford to lose. The Ottoman Empire, despite its defensive victories, was bleeding men and resources it could not replace. Entire Turkish divisions had been reduced to skeleton strength, and the constant pressure of defending multiple fronts was straining the empire's military capabilities to the breaking point. The Allied position was equally desperate, despite their numerical superiority and control of the sea. Casualties had mounted to levels that shocked even commanders hardened by the slaughter on the Western Front. Hospital ships carried endless streams of wounded men away from the peninsula, while fresh reinforcements arrived only to be fed into the same killing machine that had consumed their predecessors. Disease continued to ravage both armies as the summer heat gave way to autumn rains that turned the trenches into muddy swamps. Malaria, dysentery, and typhus spread through the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the front lines. More men were evacuated due to illness than to enemy action, and medical facilities struggled to cope with the dual burden of battle casualties and epidemic disease. The withdrawal from Gallipoli in December 1915 and January 1916 would prove to be the only Allied operation of the entire campaign executed with skill and precision. Under cover of darkness and deception, exhausted soldiers abandoned the trenches they had held at such terrible cost, leaving behind the graves of 250,000 men from both sides. The beaches that had witnessed such carnage fell silent at last, but the echoes of Gallipoli would resonate through history. For the Turks, it was a victory that forged a nation under Mustafa Kemal's leadership. For the ANZACs, it became a defining tragedy that created legends from suffering and transformed distant colonies into proud nations with their own identity, carved from sacrifice on foreign soil.